All right. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening. I'll note that we had scheduled tonight's speaker, Serena Zabin, to appear live in the Churchill and Janet Franklin Lyceum last year to help mark the 250th anniversary of the Boston Massacre, but then the pandemic struck. Actually, the last live program that we had here at the museum was a gallery talk on March 5th itself. At the time, we had our exhibit Beyond Midnight, Paul Revere and His Ride. So we gave a talk about his famous engraving. It was really the last time the public has been in our museum because we had to close a few days later. So we are pleased on the eve of the 251st anniversary to welcome Professor Zabin virtually. She's coming to us from her office at Carleton College in Minnesota. I mentioned to her in an email today that we're experiencing a cold snap, much like the weather on March 5th, 1777, when chunks of ice were allegedly thrown at the British sentry, keeping watch at the Custom House that fateful evening. I should note that Professor Zabin has roots in this area, having grown up in Lexington, proud graduate of Lexington High School. She's currently a professor of history and director of the American Studies program at Carleton. And in addition to being the author of this book, which we'll discuss this evening, The Boston Massacre, A Family History, she's the co-designer of Witness to Revolution, a video game about the massacre, as well as the author of other books and articles. So Serena, let's begin with the events themselves that galvanized Boston in 1770, and then we'll go backwards to better understand the thesis of your new book. But can you remind us of kind of what we know or think we know about what happened on the evening of March 5th, 1777?
Absolutely. So, thank you for having me, of course, for bringing me back, at least kind of virtually to Massachusetts. And I actually don't know how many of you who are watching are in Massachusetts experiencing this kind of cold snap. But whether you're actually experiencing it or just thinking about it, thank you, Tom, for setting the scene for us a little bit as we think about this event that comes to be known as the Boston Massacre. So to set the scene, we need to think that it was indeed March. So we're just 250 years and 360 days or something from the event. And so we're remembering a night in March 5th, which was indeed quite cold and dark, and there was ice. There had been some fresh snow on the ground. And we have to imagine ourselves right into the center of Boston, right in front of what's now the old State House, what was then called the Townhouse, King Street, Washington Street and State Street, right on that corner. And we have to think about a town that is only about 16,000 people, only about a square miles before the Back Bay is all filled in. And it not only has 16,000 Boston residents, but also in 1770, it has resident in the town, another 2,000 soldiers almost, or maybe a few less than that, but actually 1,000 soldiers, and several hundred women and children who are associated with those troops. So that night, there is a sentry in front of the old State House, really in front of the Customs House, that's sort of kitty corner to it, and making sure that nobody harasses this particular piece of Crown property. And there are a number of people on the street. It's about 9 o'clock at night. It's not that, not that late. It's dark. Boston doesn't have any street lights yet. They won't get street lights till 1772. But there's some lights from people's windows and even from their doorways. And a number of people start to harass this sentry. We don't really know how many. Sort of all depends on who you listen to, but enough. And they start to hassle him enough that he gets anxious and he calls for backup. So he hollers, and from just a few hundred yards away, a number of soldiers led by the captain of the day come out to support him marching up King Street. And so this handful of soldiers, 7 or 8 soldiers, and a captain line up with the sentry, and the captain orders the people in the street to disperse, and they don't. And at some point, more and more people come, and it becomes sort of crowded in this square, and someone yells fire. We don't actually know who, but someone yells fire, and the soldiers fire. And when the smoke clears, there are 5 Bostonians dead or dying, bleeding on the snow in front of the townhouse, the center of governmental power. And that's the event that we come to know as the Boston Massacre.
And we mostly know it through Revere's engraving, which is a piece of propaganda. And we have a slide showing that, and maybe you can again explain why this may not be a fully accurate picture, but what Revere was trying to accomplish in creating it.
Absolutely. So this, I mean, if you know anything about the Boston Massacre, really, likely this is what you know. This image is one of the very few pictures actually created in the American colonies. So it's reprinted in every textbook, everywhere imaginable. 4th graders know this picture well. But yes, it is a piece of propaganda that was engraved by Paul Revere, who is a son of liberty. So he had his own political allegiance already, which was pretty much an anti-governor position. That was pretty much how you might define much of the Sons of Liberty's politics. So the governor and all that he stood for, which really had to do with the power of the crown, not the king himself, they're fine with the king, but the power of the crown and the way in which that power is distributed through the colonies. So Revere makes this engraving. I can tell that story later. And he puts together a number of images in here that I think we all know actually are propaganda, right? So we see clearly that it's the soldiers' fault, right? We see there, for example, Captain Preston standing safely behind this line of soldiers, right? Waving his sword, urging them on. So this neat line of soldiers on the one side. And on the other side, what we see is this group of helpless, unarmed Bostonians. We see a woman right in the middle with her hands up to her sort of breast here. And she's there, I think, really to tell us that the people who surround her are not a group of thugs, right? But they're, nice bourgeois Bostonians, among whom a single woman should feel perfectly safe, right? And we also see that little dog in the front. Everybody loves the dog. The dog is often the symbol of loyalty. And I think what we see here is a lost dog, right? The symbol for Revere of lost loyalty. And, in case you're missed that somehow this is a piece of propaganda, I don't know if you can see, or maybe it's on the next slide, Tom.
Yeah, next slide. Yeah, go to the next slide.
You can see, yes, that the customs house that the sentry was in front of has been renamed Butcher's Hall, right? Just to make really clear that the people whose fault this is really have everything to do with the customs officials and the royal government that brought them there, right? They are the butchers here. They are the killers. So we can see that's the piece of propaganda that we all know. And honestly, this is taught to grade school kids. So I don't think I'm telling you anything that's a surprise to you. The piece that I do think is surprising that we have forgotten about, in fact, we've been kind of told not to notice for the last 251 years, is a different piece of propaganda that Revere is telling us here, a different piece of the story. And that is the story that puts, I call it the story sometimes of two sides, right? The Americans and the British, that put the British on one side of the street and Bostonians on the other. Because if we look at this picture, and maybe Tommy can bring us the next one, the center of the image itself, as you can see, is this kind of thick white cloud of gun smoke, right? That serves to divide soldiers from civilians. And that's the story Revere wanted to tell. But in fact, that's completely untrue. So both, like literally, both in terms of what happened that night, they're not soldiers on one side of the street and civilians on the other. They're really all mixed up together. But even more important, I think, is that figuratively speaking, soldiers and civilians were actually really closely connected by March 1770. They knew each other really well. They had all kinds of interwoven relationships. And those relationships actually are so much of what explains both the Boston Massacre and why it's so meaningful for the American Revolution.
Great. So now we'll do away with the slides for a moment. And you begin your book actually in Ireland on June 7th, 1765. Tell us whose story it is you open the book with and why.
So I open the book with a woman that I really became very enamored of, really, or attached to, named Jane Chambers. And so the book opens with her boarding a troop ship with her husband of the 29th Regiment, with their child, and being brought, as the 29th Regiment was, to Canada. That's where they start from. And I wanted to start with Jane Chambers, and I wanted to start in Ireland because I wanted to make really clear to the reader, this is not the story of the Boston Massacre that you think you know. It's not Revere's story. It's not a story that begins in Boston. If we only pay attention to Boston, we'll actually miss a whole lot of what really matters, because this is a story really about what happens when families are moving all around this very extensive British Empire. It's huge at this point in 1765. Has most of what we now call Canada, has large parts of the Caribbean, right? Indeed, by 1765, the British are in India also, though I don't quite go there.
And we don't generally think of the soldiers as having wives and children. Tell us more how common that was.
So, right, we don't usually think of this as a story, a family story, which is what I call it in the book, because we don't usually think of 18th century soldiers as having wives, or at least we don't think about them as having wives who travel with them, who are part of their daily lives. We often think of the army like a contemporary army with everything except maybe just the guns are different. But we think of it as a place full of single people, single men, right? Now we have women in combat, but at the time, the 18th century army was really a family institution. The army paid for women to be part of the army, to mostly do laundry, but to do some other work too. And they expected that at least some of the privates and many of the officers would bring with them their families, both their wives and their children, as they were redeployed around the empire.
I was intrigued by your acknowledgments. You mentioned that you were looking through some revolutionary pamphlets, era pamphlets, and that's where you saw references to the soldiers' wives, and that kind of led you. Tell us a little bit more about that discovery.
Yeah, so here in Minnesota, actually, surprisingly, Carleton College, like many of these small colleges, ended up getting a number of 18th century pamphlets that were kind of given to them in the 1930s and 40s. And at some point I was told, our special collections librarian said, oh, we have this pamphlet about the Boston Massacre. You should come check it out. And when I read it, after I read it a few times and taught it, I came across in the very first kind of set of pages in there a reference to a soldier's wife who actually was in a Bostonian's house making threats against Bostonians. And when people had read that before, I think they pretty much just focused on the threats. They looked at this and said, oh, right, here's some more examples of how the British Army was determined to ferment this, brawl that night. But when I read it, I realized, oh, what's really strange about this is that there's this woman who's a soldier's wife in some Bostonian's house, sitting around drinking beer. What is happening here? Why is she in this person's house in this kind of social way, right? And there I started pulling on strings and trying to figure out, pulling threads and trying to figure out what the story was of families, military families who came to Boston.
And Allison, show the next slide. You have a kind of illustration of what this family scene might look like. Just tell us a little more about this slide.
Yeah, so often when we think about, especially the soldiers who are in Boston between 1768 and 1772, but when we think generally about redcoats of the American Revolution, we tend to think of them as these sort of single guys, sometimes sort of trigger happy, sometimes oppressed, but we rarely think of them as these sort of family men. But when you take a look at this picture, you see right there in the middle, this man with, carrying his kid as, on his back. And, this woman in the blue dress right in the middle, carrying one, holding another one by the hand, with their skirt hitched up, and you see this somewhat exhausted looking family tramping this long line, right, marching to their next posting. And this watercolor, I think, really represents so much of what the experience was like to be in the family of a British soldier.
So let's now talk about how the chambers go from Halifax to Boston, and maybe just give us that thumbnail sketch of why the troops were called for and needed in Boston and when they arrived.
So initially, when the Chambers and the rest of the 29th Regiment are sent to Canada, they're not sent for any particular reason. They're sent because the British government has decided that they really should just move troops around every few years. If they stay in one place, sometimes they get forgotten. That happens to actually a regiment in Minorca. And they just realize that they've been there like a quarter of a century.
Not so a bad place to be, I suppose. But
I guess, but even in Minorca, people would prefer to, like, they're shooting themselves in the foot to try to get home. They're, it's quite boring, it turns out. So they come to Canada, not really expecting much except the cold. But while they're there in 1765, a different part of the British government starts trying to figure out how they're going to organize and administer essentially this new enormous empire that they have at the end of the 7 Years' War, which has ended in 1763, and particularly how they're going to continue to pay for the forts that they need there when there are quite a large number of indigenous nations who had been allies of the French, who don't recognize British sovereignty over their land. And so the British government is trying to figure out how they're going to pay for and organize this empire. And they come up with some ways of collecting taxes, both some new taxes and some new ways of collecting them. And they decide that they're going to make Boston actually the headquarters of this customs service. And when Bostonians hear this, Bostonians are, people who have an extensive international trade. It's a big port. They're not happy. And there are a number of riots and protests against the customs commissioners, the people who are in charge of collecting the taxes, and more largely against the taxes themselves. The governor gets a little freaked out, if I may say, by these riots. Riots are not unusual in 18th century Britain. I mean, most people can't vote. And so street politics are the way in which most people express their political opinions. They're fairly common. They seem to maybe be a little more vigorous in Boston than they might have been in England. So people who are used to English ones also get a little anxious, but the governor really gets worried and he asks through some back channel for troops. It turns out that in the 18th century, there are no police, right? There's no police force yet. So in order to keep order in Boston, people, or really in any town, magistrates asked for peacetime troops to come and try to put down riots and also actually try to catch smugglers. And both of those were problems in Boston. So the governor asks for troops, and through some back channels, he gets 4 regiments, 2 that come from Canada, including the Chambers, and 2 that are coming directly from England.
There's always too much material to cover, so don't spend too much time on this, but there's an issue though when they arrive about where they're going to live.
Yes.
And the next slide might help kind of shepherd you.
Let's see that.
So,
right.
What are some of the options and what happens in the end?
Tom is right. It's the temptation to go in the weeds is so great, but I won't do it. I'll say only if we think about the image that you just saw, which is Boston from Boston Harbor, that the harbor, as those of you who are tuning in from Massachusetts know, has a fort in there, right? Castle Island, now no longer an island. And the troops would, in ordinary circumstances, have been put into existing barracks. The governor, however, looking for people to try to, looking to have troops that are going to put down riots that are right, in the middle of Boston, doesn't want them out in Boston Harbor. He wants to put troops right in the center of Boston. And I won't go too far into the argument about this, but in the end, there's kind of a showdown between the governor and the commanding officer on the one side and the Boston selectmen on the other. And the compromise they come up with is that the army cannot requisition spaces in the center of Boston, right? They can't just put troops in people's houses, but they will rent them. They'll pay for them. So they end up renting spaces all around Boston. As you can see, there's not enough space to put them right in the middle of Boston. So this map shows the blue boxes are warehouses or large spaces that are used as barracks. But the red dots actually represent just a few of the many, many private homes that end up housing soldiers and often their families. So people in Boston would rent out their spare rooms, they rented out their sheds, they rented out, whatever building sitting in their backyard, part of their basement, part of their attic, whatever it might be. And they end up becoming landlords to thousands of British soldiers and their families.
And at times, as the next slide shows, they actually camp out on the Boston Common and other sites.
Right. So this is actually a picture of an encampment in London, but probably Boston Common looked like this the first month or so. The troops are indeed living, some of them in Faneuil Hall, and some of them are camping in tents in Boston Common until there's an early snowfall and it becomes clear that this is not going to be tenable.
So again, you've described that some of the soldiers come with wives and children, but others are young and dashing and single. And maybe, Allison, you can show the next slide, but of course.
Absolutely. This is my favorite image of all. All right. So when we think about troops in Boston, we often think of it from the perspective of the Sons of Liberty, right? Of people like Revere, who are so clearly trying to show us that having troops is a terrible thing, that they are a kind of despotic force, right? And people, men who are Sons of Liberty, complain vociferously about having troops in Boston. And that sometimes has been the only voice that we've heard over the last 250 years. But in fact, Boston was majority female at this moment. There are a number of young men, a lot of young men actually have been killed in the 7 Years' War, and single women came to Boston looking for work. And when they saw soldiers, they often saw marriage material. And I think that this picture of women doing laundry is a great example of how much fun it could be actually to do that kind of domestic labor when, your mate might well be, living in your spare room, or maybe you're meeting them on the street.
I'll remind our viewers that we'd love to have your questions. We're about halfway through our conversation, and we're going to try a new technique this evening and give away a free copy of Serena's book to one of you who has questions that will be selected randomly at the end of the talk. But let's talk about you talk about in the introduction to your book about just, trying to capture the humanity of all of those involved on both sides of the conflict. And let's do that through a couple of stories. So tell us the story of Private William Clark.
Well, I do love William Clark. So William Clark, who follows beautifully on that picture of those very flirtatious women doing laundry. William Clark was a great 18th century rake. He's a private in the 29th Regiment with literary ambitions. He writes a play when he's in Boston that certainly was published in Boston. Whether it was performed, we don't know. But he gets into trouble in Boston in a number of ways. He gets into trouble with the watch, probably a little drunk. He threatens to burn down the city of Boston. But then he's actually found in bed with a young woman, a 20-year-old woman whose grandfather actually is a fairly senior member of the Sons of Liberty. And when this grandfather stumbles in on his granddaughter in bed with the soldier says, William Clark says, you can't make me leave. This is my wife. In fact, she tells her sister, the granddaughter tells her sister later, well, we were married by a person who was dressed as a priest. So whether they were actually married is a little unclear, but their marriage record does show up eventually in the Boston records. And her parents are so distressed by her marrying this guy that they have a confrontation. First, they take to their beds. Then they have a confrontation with their son-in-law in which William Clark threatens his father-in-law with a loaded pistol. He ends up in jail. He's actually jailed with Preston and the other soldiers who are who've been arrested after the Boston Massacre shooting. And Preston finally pays his fine, gets him out of jail, and he ends up writing a tell-all memoir in which he names his in-laws and talks about how much he suffered for true love. So he's quite a character. He doesn't realize, I think, the ways in which his own, seduction story is part of a much larger story of how colonists, civilians, and soldiers actually have these intertwined lives that become really difficult to pull apart after the shooting.
I read a lot of history books, but there aren't a lot with subchapters, sex and courtship, like the one where William Clark shows up. I was struck by your discussion of the number of deserters, and I thought maybe you could bring that to life by telling us the story of Richard Eames.
Yeah, Richard Eames, that's actually quite a sad story. So Richard Eames should be more famous, is famous for being the one deserter who's actually shot on the Boston Common at dawn for desertion in peacetime, which is a kind of shocking record. And at the time, almost all Bostonians, no matter how well disposed they were to the governor or to his desire for troops, were horrified at seeing a young man shot on Boston Common for desertion when it's not wartime. Eames had left to he left possibly to find his family, which maybe was in Framingham. There are Eames in Framingham, and I just talked to someone to a group at Framingham State, who said there's actually a Ames Corner, I think, or a bridge named for that family. And he was found by a sergeant, and some other people had gone out to look for deserters, and brought back, probably for, probably had not intended to leave for good. It's hard to say. It's a sad story.
And talk again a little bit about the percentages who deserted, and why you surmise it was higher.
Yeah, so one of the things that's amazing about the presence of troops in Boston in those years is the desertion rate. So when there are British troops in North America during the 7 Years' War, the desertion rate is roughly 3%. That seems to be fairly typical. In the first 18 months that the 29th Regiment is in Boston, they lose 10% of their men to desertion, which is just an amazing number. Many of them seem to go to New Hampshire, actually, where I guess you can do all kinds of things, but they sort of disappear into the countryside. And it's a very political story at the time. Officers were sure that they're sort of being seduced away by civilians, and that as soon as the harvest is over, essentially these farmers are just going to like turn them out into the street, and these men will come crawling back, looking for their regular rations. Colonists, and particularly Sons of Liberty, thought, well, all of these guys are going because, Massachusetts is so beautiful. Who wouldn't want to be here? It's the land of milk and honey. So much better than being in this oppressive institution like an army. In fact, it seems like the truth is a little of both and a little of neither, that really men don't just desert to leave the army. They actually become connected to the people they meet, and they end up staying with them. Right. So they make families. They may go out to look for work, but then once they do, they marry the farmer's daughter, and that happens surprisingly often.
I want to talk about the aftermath, but I want to be sure to pause and that my questions have kind of fully elicited, your primary thesis. So maybe we get by that by, again, why do you call it a family history? And what's the overall thesis of the book that you're trying to explore?
So what I think really matters about the Boston Massacre and why we need to think of it as a family history is because in 1770, nobody thinks when the shooting happens that this is the end of the colonies, that this is the beginning of the American Revolution, right? They've been thinking of the colonies, and they think about Britain in this familial relationship, right? As children, maybe the colonies are ungrateful children, and maybe the mother is mean, who knows? But this relationship between a mother country and a child. And so really the shooting marks, I think, not the beginning of the American Revolution, but what we start to see is the breakdown of this family. And that happens metaphorically, right? In these very ways in which, colonies start talking about the mother country, but it actually happens in real terms as well, because after the shooting, soldiers are redeployed, right? They're moved. They take all the soldiers out of Boston, or not quite, but they want to move them all out of Boston. They move a bunch out to the harbor. And then what that does is it breaks up the families that soldiers made with those young women that they met, and with actually lots of the other folks that they came to know in those 18 months. Some soldiers decide to stay, and that's part of the desertion, right? But some leave, they self-divorce, they leave their new families here, and sometimes, of course, their new families go with them, right? These little shards of Boston traveling around the British Empire as part of the British Army. And so to understand actually why the American Revolution mattered to people, especially the beginning of it, to understand like what emotional weight it had, why those bonds were so hard to break, we have to understand that actually these were real people who made real families, and that the Boston Massacre starts to pull those apart.
We've got some great questions from the audience, so please keep them coming. But before I turn to them, and Allison, let's bring up the next slide. So let's just talk briefly about the aftermath, because it doesn't end, obviously, with deaths, but there's a whole having to figure out what actually happened, and then a system of justice. So we'll just briefly go over that before we turn to questions. So explain to us what we're seeing here.
Absolutely. So the night of the shooting, that very night, the officer in charge turns himself in, and probably most of the soldiers, but they didn't really write down who went out that night. So hopefully they got them all. They're never totally sure themselves. But they put them in jail, and the governor says, there'll be a trial, that this is, this is not going to be military justice. This is going to be a civilian trial. And eventually, through a story that probably most of these, the audience knows, I think, John Adams is retained as the lawyer for the defense, which always seems a little strange to people if they have to kind of think that through, right? And that actually the lawyer for the prosecution is the Crown lawyer, is actually the official attorney general, although some of the Sons of Liberty are never completely convinced that he's going to do a good enough job, so they also enlist Robert Treat Paine to come and help out just in case. But the defense, the people who are defending first the officer and then the soldiers, are of course John Adams and Josiah Quincy, who's a sort of junior lawyer in that. And Adams decides to separate the trial. He has the trial of the officer first, which turns on the question about whether or not the officer gave an order to fire, and then a secondary trial for all the privates, in which the question at hand really is, did they fire in self-defense? So the trial works on its own legal logic, and that happens in the fall, following in October, November. But these pamphlets that Tom's put up here are really the first round of the trial, which is the kind of PR fight, right? So almost immediately thereafter, right after the shooting, the selectmen, the town meeting puts together a committee to collect stories about what happened that night. How do they know that this was actually premeditated murder? And they publish in the first 3 weeks or so that first pamphlet that's called A Short Narrative, that you can see on top. The Army pushes back as fast as it can with another pamphlet with their own depositions called A Fair Account. And, basically one side says this was premeditated from the beginning. They meant to shoot us. These are, this is what happens really when a government gets out of control. And the other side says, no, our men were so restrained and they were so calm, and they're just like walking down the street every day and people are harassing them. And so there was a shooting. And the story, of course, lies somewhere in between those two.
It's, I think, interesting for all of us, looking back at, we personally had never experienced something like an insurrection that we just, and now, we understand, and even now there are unbelievably different views of what happened there on the Capitol. So before I go to the questions, maybe just the result of the trial in the end was?
So, and in the end, John Adams does, through what Hilaire Zabel calls a brilliant piece of lawyering, gets almost everyone off, gets off the officer and all of the soldiers except 2 who are convicted of manslaughter, which given that there are 5 deaths, is actually, indeed pretty impressive, because there were absolutely Bostonians who thought there are 5 deaths. There's got to be 5 bullets that got shot there. Right? 5 people should be responsible.
I was interested again, and we encourage people to read the book. That Adams is effective at who he gets on the jury, and you suggest that once that happens, since it had to be a unanimous verdict, that Captain Prescott was sure to go free. Okay, our first question. Were the Bostonians especially unruly, more so than people in other states? Who came up with tar and feathering?
Oh, 2 great questions there. So Bostonians were not, I think, particularly unruly. And that was the point I was trying to make about, how magistrates all over the place, and you see this just as much in England actually as you do in parts of North America. Magistrates are always asking for troops to come and keep order. Then, of course, as soon as the troops come, the magistrates usually like, "Oh, that was a mistake. Could you take them back again?" Because they actually don't really like having these people, swarming all over their public houses and, camping on the public green. But in fact, Britain is kind of, Britain is full of upheavals, especially in the 1760s. There are riots in London. In fact, there are riots in London that happen really in 1768, in which an officer, is convicted of shooting civilians in the street. Right, there are riots, and there seems to be this sort of preview of the Boston Massacre happening even in London. So Massachusetts is not particularly out of hand, I think. And in fact, people in Massachusetts are offended by the very idea of it. Tarring and feathering.
Won over your audience tonight.
They say we are not a mobbish people. So they're constantly claiming how virtuous they are, people in Massachusetts. Tarring and feathering probably comes also from a maritime tradition, from which, of course, one has a lot of tar that you're using to caulk your hulls. And it seems to have a real peak in this moment, right, of the 1760s and 1770s. And I'll say that there's wonderful work by a historian named Benjamin Irvin, so I can take credit for everything I know comes from him. But it is, it's, tarring and feathering is quite painful. And it's sort of, it looks like a joke. It really isn't, right? But it also doesn't last very long as a kind of public punishment. After about 20 years, it just sort of seems to fade away.
Was there much interaction between the soldiers and enslaved people in Boston?
That's a really important question. So there's absolutely some, in a couple of different ways. So there are actually a number of free African descended soldiers who are part, especially the 29th Regiment. And they do seem to have also made connections with both the free and enslaved African descended population in Boston. So there's a way in which, absolutely Black soldiers, and especially it seems like ones with connections to the West Indies, so many of them are have Jamaican connections, they do seem to find each other. There's also some intriguing stories about the ways in which officers, at least, might have been interested in, tweaking white Sons of Liberty's noses, we might say, by threatening slave revolts. So there's certainly a story that I talked about in there where an officer tells a number of enslaved men, you should go home and cut your master's throats and the army will protect you. And, some of them are enslaved by selectmen who hear the story. And the selectmen go after this officer who says, "Oh, I was drunk. I didn't mean anything by it." But the selectmen I think get anxious. And actually, all of those men, all those enslaved men are free before the revolution begins. So it seems to spark something, some anxiety. I'm not going to say an abolitionist movement, but some anxiety on the part of some of the slaveholders in Boston.
This viewer's son is wondering how to play the video game. The preview looks awesome.
Thank you. I'm so glad the preview looks awesome. We are really hoping to have a beta version to play test this summer. So if that happens, you should both watch my website, but also we would do it probably through the old State House in Boston. So take a look at Revolutionary Spaces. But yes, we're hoping to have a beta version to play around with.
Great. This person asked, does the incident of the killing of 12-year-old Christopher Snyder on February 22nd play a role to aggravate the situation leading to the Boston Massacre, in your opinion?
Right. So, yes, I mean, the death of Christopher Snyder, or Sider, we don't even quite know what his name is, I find really intriguing. So everybody, I mean, from March 5th, 1770 on forward, sees his death as one of a series of incidents that ends up leading to the shooting that night, right? And so people are writing in their diaries, oh, first Christopher Sider, and then there's this brawl, and then there's the shooting. I mean, of course, Christopher Sider, I mean, which maybe we forget, he was not killed by a soldier. In fact, he's killed by a kind of low level hanger on really of the customs commissioners. And when the soldiers hear, when the officer in charge that night hears that there's going to be a problem, he tells all of his subordinate officers and the men, he said, stay away. This is not our fight. We are not allowed to be in the street this night. I'm going to be a bystander. He's very clear. He uses that word. And so the army really deliberately pulls away from anything that has to do with Sider. It really becomes part of a story that gets put together later. Otherwise, it's kind of a random incident.
Can you say more about how relationships changed between soldiers and colonists after March 1770? How fast did that change happen? How long before soldiers became, quote, the enemy, as opposed to just the occupying authority?
That's the heart of the question. And it's so interesting. So right after the shooting, not that much changes. In fact, there's about 40 marriages that I found that are in the churches between soldiers and civilians, and half of them happen after March 5th, 1770. So the shooting itself doesn't really turn these soldiers into the enemy, right? And neither even does their leaving, right? So women who had married soldiers and who then are left behind when the soldiers leave, they mostly, if they can, they're often left impoverished, right? So if they live through that experience of being in the poorhouse and other things, they often remarry local Massachusetts men. There's sort of no stigma. The moment I think that soldiers really start to look like the enemy happens after the Boston Tea Party. At that moment, you really start talking about, who is not just a supporter of the governor, right, which can be any political thing, but really who is loyal. And once you get to that language of who is loyal, on the other hand, who is a patriot, that's really loaded language. We don't see that in 1770. We start to see it in 73, though.
This person is interested in the average rent that British soldiers would have paid at the time. I'm curious to how it compares to modern times in Boston currently.
Oh, wow. That is such a great question. And I don't think I can really answer it. I think partly because it requires a little more digging than I did. So I did have all of these fabulous receipts about how much the army ended up owing people when they rented their spaces. But because there are not a lot of landowners or house owners in Boston, right? So many people, even kind of, people that we now consider middle class, they rented, right? So all we have are these big aggregate sums that are being given to large owners who have, 3 warehouses and 4 houses that they're renting. I do know some numbers sort of quarterly for a few houses. But again, it's hard to translate funds. I would say though, overall, was probably lower than what we would pay now.
I hope this question doesn't mind. I'm going to change the question slightly, but can you tell us a little bit about Crispus Attucks? He's a hero to some. He's kind of the root of all evil to, he's kind of used a little bit, or he and his kin, by John Adams and his defense. So just tell us a little bit more about that complicated history.
Right. So Crispus Attucks absolutely is one of the people who shot that night. What we know of him is he too, somewhat like Private Eames, was probably from Framingham, probably descended from both Wampanoag and African family. Had been a sailor, but the role that he played that night is a little hard to figure. John Adams has him as one of the leaders of the, kind of press of people throwing things at the soldiers. But he does that really in order to make an argument that says, well, the people who are throwing things at the soldiers, they're not real Bostonians. They are these people of color. They are apprentices. They're Irish people. They're sailors, but they're not real Bostonians like us. And that's the way he's able to make his argument, is by saying Crispus Attucks doesn't belong here. And it's an uncomfortable piece to read right now. So Attucks himself is, he's honored in the moment by the Sons of Liberty as one of the people who is killed that night. His body lies in state in Faneuil Hall. And then he is pretty much forgotten until the 1850s, when a Black historian really resuscitates him as part of the argument for Black patriots of the Revolution in the kind of run up to the Civil War, to say, actually, African Americans have been here, a part of the US, fighting for the United States forever, since its inception. And he's the one that really pulled Attucks up, and then other organizations, much more conservative white organizations, including Massachusetts Historical Society, were horrified at the idea that they should be honoring somebody like Crispus Attucks. And it's really not until Boston gets its first Irish mayor that all of those martyrs of the Boston Massacre actually get a monument.
You just mentioned the Sons of Liberty. There's a question essentially asking how popular were they at the time among everyday Bostonians?
Great question. So let's see. So the Sons of Liberty, I'd say pretty much, at this moment, those late 1760s, early 1770s, there's a core group of guys, right? And they are their own little, political elite. And then there are a couple of hundred people who associate themselves with the Sons of Liberty. And, so for the most part, they are, fairly popular. But I'd say also, as we maybe would think about for today, that there are, of those 16,000 Bostonians, right, there are a lot of people who are just not that political, right? They're not paying that much attention. There may be moments when they're going to rouse up and join together. So in 1767, for example, they say, well, we're going to boycott some of these imported goods, right? And indeed, they get the Sons of Liberty get hundreds of signatures from people saying, we will not buy, we will not import these goods, including from hundreds of women, right, who also sign off on this. So men and women will support these movements, but they ebb and flow, and then people are like, I just want to live my life.
One more question from the audience, and then I have my own concluding question. So the one from the audience, pretty straightforward, is what was the sentence for the men who were convicted?
The two men who were convicted of manslaughter end up with a punishment where they're branded on the thumb, right? To show that basically they would have had a capital punishment, right? But they were sort of, they got their one freebie, and the branding really shows any court in the future that they don't get another out.
Great. So I thought I'd conclude the way, allow you to conclude the way you conclude the book. So in your epilogue, you suggest that some call the American Revolution a civil war, a clash of citizens struggling over the definition of a new country. But you write it would be no less accurate to call it a sibling war. And you observe that the massacre marked not the beginning of the American Revolution, but the breakdown of a family. So then you conclude the book with the story of the Flucker family. I don't know if I'm pronouncing the name correctly, who were torn asunder by war. And I thought that might be a good way to end the evening for you to tell us the story of that family.
So Lucy Flucker, some of you may know, ends up marrying, I've just lost his name, but perhaps you have it right in front of me, Henry Knox, who becomes, of course, the Secretary of War under Washington, right? But at the time, he's just a Boston bookseller. But he is he's a staunch son of liberty, and when the time comes, he joins the Continental Army. Meanwhile, her sister marries an army officer I named Urquhart, and her mother also, her father dies. Her mother also leaves when the after the occupation of Boston in 1776, she leaves for Halifax, and Lucy never sees her mother or her sister again. They write, but they are, all of them, actually really distressed by the idea of a world in which politics has so divided their family that they never see each other.
I'll quote from her and then from you. You write, as Lucy wrote in 1777 to her sister Hannah, quote, "How horrid this war, brother against brother and parent against child." And then the final sentence of your book, "The physical intimacy of the occupation of Boston had created families and friendships, and their destruction is the cornerstone of America's founding." So Serena Zabin, thank you so much for bringing this multi-layered story and groundbreaking social history to us, bringing it alive to us this evening. And let me thank all of you viewers for tuning in. I hope you'll join us a week from now when we feature Glenn Adamson on his new book, Craft in American History. Please note that program will begin at 5 p.m., not at 7. And if you're interested in this type of social history, mark your calendars for March 31st, when we'll be joined by historian Mary Beth Norton in a conversation about a number of her award-winning books looking at gender in early America. So Serena, thank you again. Thank you all for joining.